The wind screamed across the Montana plains like a wild beast let loose, carrying snowflakes sharp enough to cut. Eleanor Hayes pressed her back against the rough bark of a lone cottonwood tree, clutching her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wool was no match for the savage cold. Each gust sliced through her worn dress and patched gloves until it felt as though the storm itself wanted to drive her from the earth. Her fingers, stiff and half-numb, fumbled with the clasp of the carpetbag, the single possession she could still call her own. Inside lay everything that remained of a life already stripped bare, 25 years old, and with not a soul to turn to. The thought pressed heavy on her chest as she squinted toward the horizon. Storm clouds gathered there like an advancing army, dark and merciless as her prospects. 3 days ago, she had been Miss Hayes, the schoolteacher of Bitter Creek. Respected, if not wealthy. Now she was just another woman with nowhere to go, and winter bearing down like a freight train. The school board had gathered in Miller's General Store last Tuesday, faces grim as undertakers. "Budget's been cut again," old Mr. Peterson had said without meeting her eyes. "The territory can't afford to keep a teacher through the winter months." And just like that, her position was gone. The tiny room she rented above the bakery vanished with it. Mrs. Kowalski needed the space for paying tenants. The baker's wife had tried to sound kind, but sympathy didn't keep a woman from freezing. Eleanor shifted her weight, the coins in her pocket clinking softly, $3 silver, every cent to her name. Not enough for passage east, even if there were a place left to call home. Her family farm in Ohio had been sold to cover debts 2 years ago. Her intended, Harold Wickham, had made it clear that a penniless teacher was not a suitable wife for a man of his standing. The memory burned worse than the cold. The wind howled again, fierce and wild, carrying a taste of real snow, the kind that buried a person whole. She'd heard the stories, travelers found come spring, frozen stiff as fence posts. Her stomach tightened with a fear sharper than hunger. Through the swirling white she glimpsed the iron gates of the Caldwell Ranch. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew that name. Thomas Caldwell owned the largest spread in 3 counties, cattle by the thousands. A house fine enough for any Eastern lady. Eleanor had seen him in town only a handful of times. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes the cold blue of a winter sky. Polite when he tipped his hat, but distant as the mountains. She had heard the whispers too. His wife dead these past 2 years, lost in childbirth with their second son. 2 boys now motherless, raised by a man the church ladies loved to cluck about. "A man can't run a house and raise babies both," they said, though none of them offered more than an occasional casserole. Eleanor wasn't sure what pulled her feet toward those gates. Desperation, perhaps, or the simple truth that freezing under a tree was a pitiful way to end a life. The gate stood open, a strange sight for such a prosperous ranch. Before she'd even decided, her boots crunched through the thin layer of snow and carried her up the long drive. Each step was a battle against the rising storm. Snowflakes clung to her shawl and hair, erasing her tracks almost as soon as she made them. The house loomed out of the white like something from a dream, 2 solid stories of timber, glass windows glinting with what little light the gray sky allowed. Smoke curled from the chimney. Warm yellow light spilled from the downstairs windows. A beacon in the endless cold. It looked like everything she had lost, and everything she had never dared to hope for, all wrapped in one impossible promise. She stood trembling at the edge of the porch, carpetbag in hand, snow gathering on her shoulders. When the front door swung open, Thomas Caldwell filled the doorway like he'd been carved from the same sturdy logs as the house itself. Even from 30 feet away, she could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He stepped onto the porch, bareheaded despite the bitter wind. "You lost, miss?" His voice carried easily across the yard, deep, steady, and solid as bedrock. Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks despite the cold. What in heaven's name was she doing here? What excuse could possibly sound like anything but begging? "The storm came up sudden," she called back, her voice nearly lost to the wind. It was true enough, though far from the whole truth. Thomas studied her silently, taking in the threadbare coat and the way she clutched the carpetbag like a lifeline. His eyes were sharp, the kind that missed nothing. Then he stepped down from the porch and started toward her, boots biting into the snow with measured purpose. "You're the schoolteacher," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. It wasn't a question. Was, Eleanor corrected, lifting her chin even as her voice threatened to shake. My position was eliminated this week. He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. Figured as much when I saw you walking up the drive with everything you own in that bag. The blunt observation sent fresh heat to her face. Was she that obvious? That pathetic? Storm's getting worse, Thomas said, glancing up at the sky. Be a blizzard before long. You got somewhere to be? The simple question hit like a physical blow. Somewhere to be. If only. Not particularly, she managed. They stood there in the falling snow, two strangers measuring each other while the wind shrieked around them. Eleanor watched calculation flicker behind those winter blue eyes. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and deliberate. I've got coffee on the stove. House is warm. Storm like this, a person could freeze before making it. Back to town. It was an offer, plain, practical, but it carried the weight of something more. Acknowledgement of how desperate her situation truly was. That's very generous, Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor said, pride warring with survival. But I couldn't impose. You're not imposing. He turned back toward the house with quiet authority. Come on, before we both turn into ice sculptures. For one last heartbeat, she hesitated, measuring pride against the sharp edge of death. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She followed Thomas Caldwell toward the welcoming glow of the house, her boots crunching through the snow that fell faster now, erasing every step behind her. The porch offered blessed relief from the wind. When Thomas opened the door, a wave of heat rolled out like salvation itself. Eleanor stepped inside and caught her breath. The entryway alone was larger than the room she'd rented above the bakery. Polished wood floors gleamed in the lamplight. A staircase curved gracefully to the second floor, like something from an Eastern picture book. But it was what she didn't see that held her attention. No flowers, no embroidered cushions, no gentle touches of a woman's hand. The house was clean, immaculate, even but stark and functional, a barn wearing fine clothes. Thomas set his hat on a peg and turned toward the interior of the house. Boys, he called, his deep voice echoing through the halls. Come meet our guest. The sound of running feet echoed from deeper in the house. A quick patter over polished wood. Two small faces peeked around the corner of what looked like a sitting room. The older boy, 7, maybe 8, had his father's strong jaw and eyes as sharp as cut glass. The younger, perhaps 5, wore a mop of hair that refused to stay flat and a look of fearless curiosity. This is Miss Hayes, Thomas said, resting a broad hand against the doorframe. She's going to wait out the storm with us. The older child, Daniel, if town gossip had named him correctly, studied Eleanor with open suspicion. The younger, Samuel, stepped forward as though danger didn't exist. Are you really a teacher? Samuel asked, his small voice carrying a disarming authority. I was, Eleanor said, crouching to meet his gaze despite the chill still clinging to her bones. Do you like learning things? Papa says I have to learn my letters, but they are hard at first, she agreed gently. But once you know them, they open secret worlds. Samuel nodded, solemn as a little judge. Daniel stayed where he was, watching her as if a single blink might give her the chance to steal the silverware. Coffee's this way, Thomas said, gesturing toward a doorway. Boys, finish your supper. The kitchen stretched out before her like the heart of the house, huge, warm, and functional. A massive cook stove radiated heat strong enough to thaw her frozen fingers. Cabinets reached toward the ceiling, but despite the size, the space felt lonely. No lace curtains, no flowers on the table. A house kept in perfect order, yet starved for life. Thomas poured steaming coffee from a dented pot, the dark liquid strong enough to wake the dead. Eleanor wrapped her chilled hands around the tin cup, savoring the heat. Storm's getting worse, Thomas said, nodding toward the window where snowflakes now fell thick and heavy. Roads'll be impassable by morning. Eleanor stared into the black swirl of her coffee, searching for a polite reply that wouldn't sound like the plea it truly was. She could not ask to stay the night. It would be improper. And yet she had nowhere else to go. I heard about the school, Thomas said after a moment. Shame. Children need learning. Not enough to pay for it, apparently. Her voice cracked, despite her best effort. Territory's strapped for cash, he replied, matter-of-factly. Railroads taking its sweet time getting here. Without easy cattle transport, taxes are down. The politicians in Helena cut budgets where they can. Education goes first. He studied her over the rim of his cup. What'll you do now? The question landed like a blow. Eleanor set down her cup, fingers trembling slightly. I'm not sure. Look for another position, I suppose. Where? One short word. Yet it stripped her defenses bare. There were no other positions. Not within 100 miles. Not for a woman alone, with no money for travel. I don't know, she admitted. Thomas was silent for a long stretch. Outside, the wind shrieked around the house, rattling the window panes. Somewhere down the hall, one of the boys laughed at some private joke, a bright sound against the storm's fury. I've got a proposition for you, Thomas said finally, each word measured. Eleanor looked up, startled by the change in his tone. I need a wife. The cup nearly slipped from her grasp. I beg your pardon, Eleanor. A business arrangement, he continued steadily, as if discussing cattle prices. Someone to keep house, help with the boys, make sure there's hot food on the table and clean clothes in the drawers. Winter's coming hard. I can't manage it all alone. Eleanor stared, certain she must have misheard. Men did not simply propose marriage to women they barely knew, certainly not men like Thomas Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, I hardly know you. What's to know? He countered calmly. I pay my debts, keep my word, don't drink to excess or raise a hand to women or children. I own this land free and clear and have money in the bank. You'd want for nothing. His directness stole the air from her lungs. No sweet words, no romance, just cold, practical truth. The boys need a mother, he added, his voice softer now. They're good children, but they're running wild without a woman's influence. And he paused, choosing each word carefully. I need a partner, someone I can count on. Outside, the storm wailed like a living thing. Inside, Eleanor felt the $3 silver in her pocket like the mocking weight of destiny. The long winter ahead stretched before her, a white death sentence if she faced it alone. It wouldn't be a real marriage, Thomas added quickly, as though reading her thoughts. Separate rooms, separate lives, in many ways. Just two people helping each other through. Eleanor's heart pounded. No love, no false promises, only survival. I need time to think, she managed. The storm's not going anywhere, Thomas replied, glancing at the windows now blurred with white. Neither are you tonight. We can talk more in the morning. And just like that, the decision was postponed but not escaped. The wind screamed outside, but inside the Caldwell house, a different kind of storm had already begun. The room Thomas gave her was small but spotless, a housekeeper's quarters at the back of the first floor. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single quilt folded with military precision, better than anything she could afford on her own. Yet the air felt thick with decisions too heavy to sleep through. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind battered the shutters like an angry giant, making the walls creak. Each gust carried the sharp reminder that she had nowhere else to go. $3 silver. A winter already clawing at the doors. No job, no family, no one waiting. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and tried to imagine a future inside this house. Cooking breakfast for a man she barely knew. Washing clothes. Tending children who might never accept her as anything more than a stranger. Living as a guest, no. As a wife in a home that would never fully belong to her. But the alternative was worse. The cold, the hunger, the deadly silence of the prairie when the snow buried the world. She had heard the stories of travelers frozen upright like fence posts come spring. Survival was no longer a question of pride. It was the only choice that mattered. Outside, the storm howled like a creature determined to keep her awake. She lay down at last, staring at the low ceiling while doubts circled like wolves. Could a marriage built on necessity ever become anything more? Would she always be the outsider who came to the gate with nothing but a carpetbag and desperation? When morning finally arrived, the world had changed. Eleanor woke to a strange silence, the kind that follows a real storm. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the smell of bacon and strong coffee drifted under the door, and the memories of last night returned with a heavy thud. She dressed quickly in her one good dress, a navy wool that had seen better days, and pinned her dark hair back as neatly as cold fingers allowed. The hallway outside her door was hushed except for the faint crackle of the stove. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, a dark figure against the blinding white outside. "Storm's blown itself out," he said without turning. "Dropped near 2 feet by the look of it." Eleanor joined him and caught her breath. The entire landscape had been erased and rewritten in dazzling white. Fence posts rose like tiny islands in a sea of snow. The road to town had disappeared entirely. "You weren't exaggerating," she murmured. "No getting out for days," he replied, still studying the horizon. Then he turned, those winter blue eyes steady on hers. "Coffee's fresh. Boys are still sleeping." She accepted the tin cup he offered, grateful for something warm to hold. The coffee was strong enough to chase the chill from her bones. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. "About the arrangement," Thomas finished, "for her." "Yes." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I need to understand exactly what you're asking." He leaned a shoulder against the counter, speaking with the same quiet certainty he'd used the night before. "The boys need consistency. Someone to make sure they eat proper meals, keep clean, learn their letters. They're good children, but they've been without a woman's guidance for 2 years. "And you?" she asked softly. "What would you expect from a wife?" "Someone to manage the household," he said without hesitation. "See that food's prepared, clothes mended. Someone I can depend on when I'm working cattle or traveling for supplies. And someone who won't run off at the first sign of hardship." Eleanor set the cup down before her shaking hands betrayed her. "And in return, a roof over your head, food on the table, my name and protection if that matters to you." His voice was practical, almost businesslike, as if he were negotiating a grain contract instead of a marriage. "You'd be mistress of this house," he continued evenly. "The boys would be yours to raise as you see fit. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more." Her heart thudded painfully. No talk of affection, no promise of love, just survival wrapped in a marriage license. "Separate rooms," she said, more to clarify than to question. "Separate rooms," Thomas confirmed. "You'd have your privacy and I'd have mine." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Unless someday we decided different. But that would be a long way off, if ever, and only if you chose it." Heat crept into her cheeks. The practical nature of the offer made sense, but the hint of something more someday stirred an emotion she refused to name. Before she could answer, the sound of small feet on the stairs broke the moment. Samuel's sleepy voice floated into the kitchen. "Papa? Is the lady still here?" Thomas straightened, the guarded look back in his eyes. "She's still here," he called. "Come say good morning." Samuel padded into the room, hair sticking up like a mischievous halo. Daniel followed more slowly, gaze sharp as ever. Eleanor forced a smile, though her mind spun with choices that felt larger than the snowbound world outside. End of Chunk 3. Would you like me to continue with Chunk 4? The growing bond with the boys, the quiet negotiations, and Eleanor's eventual decision to accept the marriage of convenience. You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, "Understood, here's Chunk 4. Where Eleanor's connection to the boys deepens, and the choice she's been avoiding begins to tighten around her like the winter cold. This rewrite keeps the tense, dramatic rhythm, easy language, and a touch of scandalous intrigue. Rewrite. Chunk 4. Samuel darted across the wide kitchen floor and tugged at Eleanor's skirt with unfiltered curiosity. "Are you staying with us?" he asked, eyes bright as new pennies. "For now," she said carefully, "until the roads open again." Samuel beamed, satisfied with that small victory. Daniel, older and sharper, said nothing. He studied her as if testing a math problem no one else could solve. Thomas poured more coffee and slid a cup toward Eleanor. "Boys, finish your breakfast, then chores." "Yes, Papa," Samuel chirped, climbing into his chair. Daniel followed with the air of a soldier obeying orders, his suspicious gaze never leaving Eleanor. The meal passed in small bursts of conversation. Samuel asked endless questions about letters, about snow, about the world beyond the ranch. Eleanor answered patiently, enjoying the sparkle of his curiosity, even as she felt Daniel's silent measuring. When the boys were sent to the sitting room, Thomas rested his forearms on the table. The storm outside had eased to a soft, deceptive quiet. "You need a place to stay," he said without preamble. "I need someone I can trust. We'd both get what we need." The simple truth of it left Eleanor with no easy reply. She thought of the $3 in her pocket, the empty road back to town, the endless miles of white. She had nothing but this carpetbag and a name that meant less every day. Thomas watched her wrestle with the decision, his winter blue eyes steady but unreadable. "I'm not offering romance," he said finally. "Just a partnership. We'd keep separate rooms, but you'd have security. The boys would have a mother's guidance." The words, "mother's guidance," pressed against a door in her heart she'd kept locked. She pictured Samuel's fearless grin and Daniel's guarded eyes. They deserved more than a hired housekeeper who might leave when the snow melted. "I don't know you," she whispered. "You'll learn," he replied simply. "Same as I'll learn you." Eleanor looked down at her trembling hands. This wasn't the proposal she'd dreamed of as a girl back in Ohio. No flowers, no soft confessions, only survival dressed in plain words. And yet, the offer was solid, as real as the timber walls shielding them from the cold. A man who made promises he intended to keep. A house already filled with the laughter of children who needed someone. "I need time," she said again. "You have it," Thomas replied. "Storm will keep you here a while. Think as long as you need." That night, the wind died to a whisper, but Eleanor's mind refused to rest. She lay awake in the small back room, staring into darkness that felt as heavy as the decision ahead. Marriage without love. Security without freedom. A family built on necessity. Could such a life ever grow into something more, or would it freeze like water left too long in the winter air? She thought of Harold Wickham, the suitor back east who had once promised comfort, but abandoned her when the money disappeared. Thomas Caldwell was no Harold. His words held no false sweetness, only the steady weight of truth. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and full of restless dreams. Morning arrived with a sky so bright it hurt her eyes. The world outside glittered like it had been forged from crystal. Inside, the house smelled of bacon and wood smoke. Solid, safe, alive. Eleanor dressed with careful hands, each button a small act of defiance against the uncertainty tightening around her. Whatever choice she made, it would be hers. In the kitchen, Thomas waited with 2 steaming cups and a question she could no longer avoid. "Well?" he asked quietly. "Have you thought about my offer?" Eleanor's throat tightened. The storm had ended, but the real test was only beginning. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, dazzling against the fresh snow. Eleanor sat at the heavy oak table, fingers wrapped around a cup gone cold. Thomas stood by the stove, silent but steady, waiting. Every tick of the mantel clock sounded like a hammer driving her toward an answer. She thought of the road buried under drifts, the $3 in her pocket, the long winter crouching like a predator just outside these walls. She thought of Samuel's fearless questions, of Daniel's quiet watchfulness, of the laughter that still managed to echo through a house built from loss. Finally, she set the cup down with a soft clink. "If I agree," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what would you expect of me?" Thomas turned, his blue eyes fixed on hers. "Honesty. Care for the boys. A steady hand to keep this place running. That's all. I don't drink. I don't raise my hand to children or women. You'd be safe here." "Safe," Eleanor repeated, tasting the word. Safety had become more precious than pride. "And affection?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "This is a practical marriage," Thomas said carefully. "No false promises. We keep separate rooms. If, in time, we and both choose differently, that will be our choice. But I won't demand anything from you." His bluntness cut through the last of her doubts. No deception, no charm, only truth. Eleanor drew a long, steady breath. "Then yes," she said at last. "I'll marry you, Mr. Caldwell." For the first time since she'd met him, Thomas's shoulders eased, though his face stayed composed. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll ride to town when the road clears and bring the preacher." The next 3 days passed in a blur of quiet preparations. The storm had locked them in, giving her no escape and no second chance to run. Eleanor spent the time mending clothes, teaching Samuel letters, and earning small flashes of trust from Daniel. Each task made the agreement feel less like desperation and more like the beginning of something, though she dared not name it. When the preacher finally arrived, an elderly man wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large, his frown could have frozen boiling water. "This is highly irregular," Reverend Morrison said for the 3rd time as he removed his snow-crusted hat. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a business arrangement." Thomas met the preacher's disapproval with quiet steel. "The marriage will be legal and binding," he said evenly. "The reasons are between us." Eleanor smoothed her best navy dress, its collar freshly pressed, though still plain. The garment was a far cry from a bridal gown, but she held her head high. The boys peeked from the hallway, their excitement barely contained. Samuel bounced on his toes, whispering to Daniel, who stood stiff and solemn like a young sentry. "Let's begin," Thomas said, his voice steady. The ceremony was brief and without flourish. Eleanor repeated words that felt both strange and heavy, each vow a step away from the life she'd known. Thomas answered with the same measured tone he used to discuss cattle prices, but his eyes never left her face. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a tense silence followed. It was clear he expected Thomas to kiss his new bride. Thomas looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She gave a small nod. His lips brushed hers in a chaste, deliberate kiss. No heat. No claim. Only the sealing of a bargain neither of them had wanted but both now needed. Mrs. Murphy, the neighbor who had agreed to witness, clapped her hands with brisk finality. "Well then," she said brightly, "that's done. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Caldwell." The name struck Eleanor like a bell, echoing through the cold air and down to the hollow spaces of her heart. She was no longer Eleanor Hayes, the penniless schoolteacher. She was Thomas Caldwell's wife, mistress of the largest ranch in 3 counties. Samuel broke the moment by darting forward, throwing his arms around her waist. "Are you really our mama now?" he asked, his voice high with excitement. "I suppose I am," Eleanor said, smoothing his unruly hair, her throat tight with something that felt dangerously like hope. Daniel hung back, his dark eyes sharp and unreadable. He gave the smallest of nods a silent challenge, or perhaps a cautious welcome. Either way, it was more acceptance than she had dared to expect. That evening, as the guests departed and the house settled into uneasy quiet, Eleanor found herself in the small room she'd claimed as her own. The title of wife weighed on her shoulders like a quilt stitched with equal parts security and uncertainty. Outside, the Montana wind prowled across the frozen plains. Inside, Eleanor Caldwell lay awake in a bed that now belonged to her and wondered what kind of future she had just promised to build. 3 weeks passed before the roads were clear enough for a proper Sunday service. Thomas announced at breakfast that the family would ride into town for church. The simple words carried the weight of a public debut. Eleanor Caldwell would finally stand before the entire Bitter Creek congregation as Thomas's wife. Eleanor dressed with deliberate care, choosing her navy wool dress again freshly pressed, collar starched until it could cut glass. She twisted her hair into a neat coil and pinned it tight, hoping the severe style would lend strength she wasn't sure she possessed. The wagon ride was silent, except for the crunch of wheels over frozen ruts. Daniel sat next to his father on the driver's bench, posture stiff with importance. Eleanor rode in the back with Samuel, who chattered about friends and hymn numbers as though nothing in the world could unsettle him. Bitter Creek's small white church came into view, its bell tower piercing the crisp blue sky. Families clustered near the door, their breath rising in smoky clouds. As the Caldwell wagon rolled up, conversations stuttered and fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned in unison, curiosity gleaming like ice. Thomas climbed down first, then offered his hand to Eleanor. She stepped to the ground, spine straight, despite the sting of cold and of scrutiny. The whispers began before her boots even touched the packed snow. "Quick work, wasn't it? Poor Margaret's barely cold. Schoolteacher thinks she's landed herself quite a prize." Eleanor heard every hiss, each one slicing like a hidden blade. She tightened her grip on Samuel's small hand and walked forward without breaking stride. If she faltered, the gossip would feast for weeks. Inside, the scrutiny sharpened. The same pew that once held Margaret Caldwell now welcomed her replacement. Eleanor felt the weight of ghosts as she sat between Thomas and Samuel. Daniel on the far side like a silent sentinel. The sermon droned about charity and Christian kindness, but the words sounded hollow against the judgment that thickened the air. After the service, the congregation spilled into the yard for the weekly social hour. The real battle began. Mrs. Henderson Banker's wife, queen of small-town opinion, approached with a smile, polished sharp. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, tasting the new name like something sour. "How are you finding married life? Quite different from teaching school, I imagine." "Different," Eleanor answered evenly, "but rewarding. I'm sure the security is comforting." "Mrs. Henderson," replied, her gaze flicking to Thomas. The emphasis on security left no doubt about her meaning. Other women gathered, drawn by the scent of fresh gossip. Mrs. Patterson, who once taught Samuel in Sunday school, added with false sweetness, "It must be difficult stepping into dear Margaret's shoes. She was so beloved by everyone." "Margaret was certainly special," Eleanor said, refusing the bait. "The boys speak of her with great love." "Oh, she was more than special." "Mrs. Jenkins chimed in. "She was a saint, always bringing soup to the sick, helping with births. When my youngest came early, Margaret stayed 3 days straight." The circle of women nodded in reverent agreement, their smiles daring Eleanor to measure herself against a legend. "She sounds remarkable," Eleanor replied softly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. The ladies blinked, disappointed by her refusal to compete. Then, Mrs. Henderson delivered the thrust. "And how are the children adjusting? It must be confusing to have a stranger suddenly thrust into their mother's place." Heat flared in Eleanor's cheeks, but before she could answer, a small voice cut through the winter air. "She's not a stranger," Samuel declared, darting forward to grab Eleanor's hand. "She's our new mama. She teaches us letters and fixes our clothes and reads us stories." The women startled at the fearless defense. Eleanor squeezed Samuel's fingers, gratitude swelling in her chest. Daniel stepped up beside his brother, eyes sharp with quiet fire. "And she makes Papa and smile," he said flatly. "Real smiles, not just polite ones." The yard fell silent. Even the preacher's wife looked away, cheeks coloring. Thomas moved forward then, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the snow. "Billy," he said, turning to Mrs. Henderson's son, who was shrinking behind his mother, "I believe you owe my wife an apology." "I was just repeating what I heard," the boy mumbled. "Then perhaps the adults should choose their words more carefully," Thomas said, his voice calm but iron-hard. The rebuke landed squarely on Mrs. Henderson, whose face flushed crimson. Mrs. Murphy, practical and fearless, seized the moment. "Seems to me," she said brightly, "these children know good character when they see it. Maybe the rest of us should take their lead." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The tide had turned. Mrs. Henderson attempted a brittle smile. "Of course. Children are wonderfully adaptable." "Yes," Mrs. Wilson added with pointed cheer, "and wonderfully honest." Eleanor felt the shift like a thaw breaking through ice. The women who had come to test her were now nodding, offering lukewarm welcomes, even small smiles. Not friendship, not yet, but the first fragile step toward acceptance. The ride home was quieter than the trip in, but it carried a different kind of silence. Not hostility, something warmer. Samuel leaned against Eleanor's arm, half asleep and wholly content. Daniel sat straighter, sneaking proud glances her way. Thomas kept his eyes on the snowy road, but a small, unmistakable smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon and paused, his hand lingering on hers. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for standing up for me." "You're my wife," Thomas replied, simple as breathing. "You touches all of us." The words weren't flowery, but they settled deep, warming her more than any fire. Inside, as she removed her gloves and shawl, Eleanor felt the day's victory humming through the walls of the big timber house. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was respect. And the first real proof that she and this fragile new family belonged together. Winter settled deeper across the Montana plains, sharpening every sound and stretching every shadow. Life inside the Caldwell house fell into a rhythm of chores, lessons, and quiet evenings. But beneath the calm, an unease began to hum. A low warning Eleanor could almost feel through the floorboards. It started with missing cattle. Thomas returned from the north pasture one morning with eyes like hard ice. 20 head gone, he said flatly. No broken fence, no tracks where they should be. Jake Morrison, the senior ranch hand, rubbed a weathered chin. Could be wolves, he offered, though his doubtful tone betrayed him. Been a hard winter. Wolves don't cut fence wire, Thomas said, and they don't drive cattle in organized groups. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, heart tightening. She'd heard the stories, bands of rustlers who swept through like ghosts, leaving ruined families and empty pastures behind. 2 nights later, Thomas called a meeting in the front parlor. Eleanor lingered in the hallway, listening as the men spoke in tense, low voices. It's not just us, said Miguel Santos, quiet and steady. Johnson Place lost 50 head. Henderson's too. Any strangers in town? Thomas asked. Jake nodded grimly. Well-dressed fellow asking questions. Claimed to be a cattle buyer, but he wanted to know which ranches own which land. How many men work each spread? A chill slid down Eleanor's spine. That wasn't random theft. That was scouting someone mapping weaknesses. There's more, Miguel added. He asked about the railroad survey. Wanted to know which route they're likely to choose. Thomas's jaw tightened. The railroad, he muttered. Someone wants our land. The room went silent as the implications settled like fresh snow. Weaken the ranch. Cut the herd. Force a sale. Later, as Thomas prepared for bed, Eleanor found her courage. This isn't just theft, she said quietly. They're trying to break you. Thomas's expression was grim but calm. They'll find out soon enough this ranch isn't for sale. The attacks escalated. By the following week, another 15 head were gone, and one prized bull lay dead in the snow shot and left to rot. The cruelty made Eleanor's stomach twist. Then came blood. Jake returned from a fence patrol, staggering, his shirt soaked with crimson. Miguel half carried him into the kitchen, where Eleanor immediately set to work. Bullet went clean through, she said, her voice steadier than her pounding heart. He'll live if we keep it clean. As she worked, Jake gritted his teeth and spoke through the pain. 3 men, maybe 4. Cutting wire near the creek. Didn't warn me. Just fired. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced precision, but inside she burned. These men weren't just thieves. They were predators sending a message. When Thomas arrived, his eyes locked on the blood-stained floor. How bad? He demanded. Painful but not fatal, Eleanor replied. He'll heal if he rests. Thomas's jaw clenched. No one rides alone. From now on, we move in pairs. That night, the household slept lightly, nerves stretched thin as wire. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the restless wind and the creak of settling timber. Just after midnight, the first shot shattered the silence. Gunfire cracked across the yard, sharp, deadly, unmistakable. Men shouted. Horses screamed. Eleanor leapt from bed and ran to the window. Dark figures moved near the barn, muzzle flashes flaring like lightning. Her body surged with cold determination. She snatched the shotgun Thomas kept by the door and raced for the boys' room. Daniel was already awake, eyes wide and unafraid. Samuel stirred, confused by the noise. Up, Eleanor ordered, her voice low but firm. We're playing the hiding game, remember? Daniel nodded and helped Samuel out of bed while Eleanor pulled on her heavy coat. In the pantry, she lifted the trapdoor to the root cellar, her secret refuge stocked with blankets and food. Down, to the very back, she whispered. Stay quiet until I come for you. Samuel's lip trembled. Will Papa be okay? Yes, Eleanor said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Your father is the strongest man I know. Now hide. When the boys disappeared into the darkness, she lowered the door and slid a heavy barrel across it. Then she turned toward the front of the house. The door splintered before she reached it. 2 men burst inside, rifles in hand. They stopped short when they saw her, a lone woman in a plain nightdress, shotgun leveled and ready. "This is private property," Eleanor said, her voice like a blade. "Leave. Now." One of the men smirked. "Looks like Caldwell's new bride wants to play soldier." "Last warning," she said, finger tightening on the trigger. They thought she was bluffing. They were wrong. The first man stepped forward. The shotgun roared. The blast echoed through the timber house, sending splinters skittering across the floor. The intruder crumpled with a scream, clutching a bleeding leg. His partner froze, gun half raised. "Next shot goes through your chest," Eleanor said coldly. The man hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. Behind him, another voice cut through the smoke. "Drop it," Thomas commanded, his rifle trained steady. "Smart choice is to leave breathing." The intruder's weapon clattered to the floor. When the last rustler was bound and the wounded man secured, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "You could have hidden," he said. His voice rough. "They're my children too," she answered simply. For a long heartbeat he just looked at her, at the steadiness of her grip, the steel in her eyes. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the shotgun from her trembling hands. "Eleanor Caldwell," he said quietly, almost in awe. "I believe you just saved this family." The following days brought lawmen and questions. But the danger had passed. The territorial marshal arrived with deputies, confirming what Thomas already suspected. A Denver syndicate was buying land for the railroad and using hired guns to force ranchers into selling. As statements were taken and evidence gathered, Eleanor noticed a subtle change. Thomas sought her opinion openly. The men treated her not as a fragile bride, but as someone who had stood her ground and proved her worth. That night, as the household finally settled, Thomas found her in the kitchen. "You didn't have to face them," he said, voice softer now. "But you did." Eleanor met his gaze, heart hammering. "This is my home too," she said. "My family." Thomas studied her for a long, quiet moment. Something warm, more than gratitude, flickered in his winter blue eyes. "Yes," he said at last. "Our family." The ranch settled into a wary quiet after the attack. Snowdrifts still sparkled in the moonlight, but the sense of danger that had haunted every night began to loosen its grip. The rustlers were gone, arrested by the territorial marshal after the captured men gave up names and routes. Yet inside the big timber house, another change, softer, more unsettling, was taking hold. Eleanor felt it in small things first. The way Thomas lingered in the kitchen after supper, asking about the boys' lessons instead of heading straight to his study. The way his eyes followed her hands as she kneaded bread or poured coffee. A silent recognition of the steadiness she had shown when bullets cracked through the night. One evening, as she changed Jake Morrison's bandages, Thomas stood in the doorway, arms folded. "You've got a gift for this," he said quietly. Steady hands, calm mind. "My mother always said those were the makings of a healer." Eleanor tied the last knot in the clean linen and looked up. "My father taught me to shoot. My mother taught me to mend. Both skills seem useful these days." Thomas's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but held the same warmth. "She raised a strong woman." Jake cleared his throat, embarrassed to be caught between them. "Doc in town couldn't do better," he muttered, and Eleanor felt a quick flush rise to her cheeks. Later that night, when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, Thomas found her again in the kitchen. The lantern light threw soft gold across the polished wood and caught the pale strands of hair that had slipped from her bun. "What you did," he began, voice rougher than usual. "That night, most men wouldn't have stood like you did." Eleanor dried her hands slowly. "I protected my family." Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "When did you start thinking of us that way, your family?" The question caught her breath. She thought of Daniel's serious eyes, of Samuel's giggle when he mastered a new letter, of the quiet partnership forming between herself and the man before her. "I don't know when it started," she admitted. "Maybe the day Samuel first called me Mama. Maybe when Daniel finally let me fix his hair without protest. Maybe the moment I heard gunfire and realized my first thought wasn't of myself, it was of keeping all of you safe." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. "I promised you a practical marriage," Thomas said finally. "No romance, no foolishness. But somewhere along the way, His voice trailed off as if he couldn't quite name what had changed. Eleanor held his gaze. "So it isn't just me," she said softly. "No," he answered, stepping closer until the scent of wood smoke and leather wrapped around her. "It isn't just you." His hand brushed hers, rough, warm, careful. The touch was small, but it sent a current through her stronger than the winter wind outside. Before either could speak again, the sound of running feet echoed down the hallway. "Papa! Mama!" Samuel called, bursting into the room with Daniel close behind. "There's a big moon outside, you have to see it." The charged moment broke like thin ice, but the warmth lingered as Thomas gave a quiet chuckle and ruffled Samuel's hair. "Let's all look," he said. They stepped onto the porch together. The moon hung enormous over the snowy plains, washing the ranch in silver light. Daniel leaned against Eleanor's side without a word. Samuel pointed at the sky with delight, and Thomas stood close enough that she felt the solid heat of his shoulder against hers. No words were spoken. None were needed. The night itself seemed to promise that something new was taking root, slow, steady, and strong. Days passed, and the territorial marshal returned with final news. The mastermind behind the rustlers, a Denver speculator named Harrison Blackwood, had been arrested. His plan to force ranchers to sell for the railroad had collapsed. Relief spread through the Caldwell household like warm sunlight. But the danger had left a mark, a deeper bond forged in shared fear and quiet victory. Thomas began to seek Eleanor's opinion on ranch business as naturally as he discussed the boys' schooling. He consulted her on cattle purchases, on fence repairs, on which men to trust with key tasks. Each question was a small acknowledgement. She was no longer just a convenient housekeeper. She was a partner. One afternoon, as they checked the ledger together, Thomas laid his pen aside and looked at her with unusual intensity. "When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I offered shelter and a name. I didn't promise anything more, but I find myself wanting more." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "More? Respect? Friendship? Maybe something stronger. Not because we need it to survive, because I want it." Her heart thudded like hooves across frozen ground. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. "Neither did I." His voice softened. "But it feels right." Before Eleanor could respond, Samuel's laughter floated in from the yard, followed by Daniel's measured call. The sound of their sons, our sons, filled the space between them, a gentle reminder of what they'd already built. Thomas reached for her hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but I know I want to face it with you." Eleanor squeezed back, the answer clear in her eyes even before the words left her lips. "So do I." Spring crept across the Montana plains with a gentle insistence, melting the last of the winter drifts and washing the land in shades of hopeful green. The danger of rustlers had passed, but something far more tender was stirring inside the Caldwell house. Eleanor noticed it in the way Thomas's smiles came easier now, real smiles that reached his eyes. She felt it in the quiet moments when their shoulders brushed while they worked side by side, in the comfortable silence that settled over them as they watched the boys chase each other through the awakening fields. The marriage that began as a bargain had quietly become a life. One evening, Thomas lingered in the doorway of the schoolroom she'd set up upstairs. 8 children now filled the bright space, their laughter and questions echoing through the house each morning. "You've built something remarkable," he said, eyes sweeping over the neatly stacked books and freshly scrubbed desks. Eleanor set down her chalk. "I only wanted the children to have a place to learn." "And you gave this house a heartbeat," he replied. The warmth in his voice carried more than simple admiration. Eleanor felt it settle in her chest, like a secret she was almost ready to name. Weeks passed, and the days grew longer. On the morning of their 6-month anniversary, Thomas appeared at the kitchen door with a curious spark in his eyes. "Come outside for a moment," he said. Eleanor followed him to the porch. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. But what caught her breath was the small convoy of wagons rolling up the lane. Neighbors, friends, even the once skeptical Henderson family. Lanterns and baskets of food glimmered in the sunlight. "What is this?" Eleanor whispered. Thomas's mouth curved into a shy smile. 6 months ago, we signed a contract. Today, I'd like to marry you for real." Before she could find words, Reverend Morrison stepped down from his buggy, Bible in hand, and a surprisingly warm grin on his face. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called cheerfully. "Your husband insists we celebrate properly this time." The neighbors spilled across the yard carrying flowers, fiddles, and enough food to feed the whole territory. "Mrs." Murphy hurried to Eleanor's side, eyes bright. "Come along, dear. We'll have you ready in no time." Inside, Eleanor's hands trembled as the women helped her freshen her best navy dress and pinned a lace collar at her throat. The reflection staring back from the mirror startled her. Gone was the desperate school teacher who had arrived in a blizzard. In her place stood a woman with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes, a woman who was loved. Outside, under a wide Montana sky, Thomas waited by a makeshift altar, decorated with wildflowers Daniel and Samuel had gathered that morning. He wore the same dark suit from their first wedding, but everything about him looked different. His stance relaxed, his smile open, his eyes alight with quiet joy. When Eleanor stepped into the sunlight, the crowd hushed. Every face turned toward her carried genuine warmth, even those who had once whispered behind cupped hands. Reverend Morrison began the ceremony with an energy that had been missing the first time. When he asked Thomas to speak, the tall rancher took Eleanor's hands and held her gaze. "6 months ago I offered you shelter and a name," he said, voice steady and rich. "Today I offer you my heart. You brought laughter back to this house, wisdom to my children, and love to a man who thought he'd lost it forever. I promise to stand beside you, to cherish you, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life." Eleanor felt tears blur the world around her. When it was her turn, she spoke with equal certainty. "Thomas, you gave me safety when I had none. But you also gave me a family, a purpose, and a love I never dared to dream of. I promise to be your partner in all things, to love your children as my own, and to build a future worthy of the hope we share." Reverend Morrison's voice rang clear. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." This time, Thomas didn't hesitate. He drew Eleanor close and kissed her, not a polite formality, but a deep, joyful claim witnessed by the entire town. The crowd erupted in cheers. Samuel whooped with delight. Daniel smiled a quiet, knowing smile that made Eleanor's heart swell. The celebration that followed overflowed with music and laughter. Neighbors danced beneath strings of lanterns. Children raced across the yard while adults shared food and stories. Mrs. Henderson, who had once eyed Eleanor with sharp suspicion, offered a toast to the finest lady Bitter Creek could hope for, earning another round of cheers. As dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor found a quiet moment on the porch with Thomas. The sounds of fiddle music and children's laughter drifted across the yard. "Thank you," she said, softly, "for giving me the wedding I never knew I wanted." Thomas tightened his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you for giving me back my life." They sat in companionable silence, watching their sons chase fireflies. The air smelled of wildflowers and wood smoke. For the first time since Eleanor had stepped onto this land, she felt not just safe, but truly at home. Later, after the last wagon disappeared down the darkening road and the boys were asleep, Thomas took Eleanor's hands once more. "No more contracts," he said quietly. "No more arrangements. Only us." She echoed. Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the open plains, carrying the scent of spring and the promise of years yet to come. Inside the Caldwell house, warmth and love held steady, strong enough to face whatever storms might rise. It was not the fairy tale beginning Eleanor once imagined. It was something far better, a love forged in hardship, chosen every day, and built to last.